Anthony Albanese is clearly very pleased that the Pacific Islands Forum Leaders Meeting has endorsed this initiative. Now, it's worth just going over why it's so significant. This has the potential to, at least in part, reshape the way that policing is done in the Pacific. There are three parts to this. The first is basically a new, rather advanced and large training facility that is going to be established in Brisbane to train Pacific police. On top of that, there's going to be a rotational force, a Pacific support group of police who will be able to go around the region providing additional help to countries that are, for example, putting on large events or who are dealing with crises, whether they're natural disasters or internal discord. And then finally, there are going to be centres of excellence that are going to be set up in 4 Pacific countries. At least one of them is Papua New Guinea. We don't know where the other 3 are going to be, that will allow Pacific Island police to develop more specialised skills, for example, in things like forensics. So it's a pretty substantial development. It's not cheap. It's some $400 million. And it's an initiative that Australia believes will have a pretty profound impact on the way that policing is done throughout the whole Pacific.
Stephen, there has been some criticism of the program, even accusations Australia and New Zealand are using it to try and box out strategic competitors from the region.
Well, that's right. I mean, it's important to remember that most Pacific leaders have supported this initiative and have for quite some time. But it is worth noting that there are some voices of dissent, or at least voices expressing a little bit of unease about exactly what's going on here. Last night, for example, during a meeting of the Melanesian Spearhead Group, the Prime Minister of Vanuatu, Shalo Salwai, as well as a senior regional diplomat, said that whilst they weren't necessarily opposed to the Pacific Islands Policing Initiative, they were at least a bit uneasy or wanted to make sure that Australia wasn't using it to try and further its aim of strategic denial. In other words, they didn't want to see Australia trying to use this to box out China from the region. Now, it's a bit awkward for Australia here because the reality is, even if this is largely propelled by a desire to improve Pacific policing in the region, it's undeniable that there's also an element, at least, of strategic denial here. Australia wants to fill the gaps with this proposal to make sure that Pacific Island countries, Australia and New Zealand, are providing all the help that other Pacific islands might need with security. And that means that there's less space for outside players that Australia regards with a bit of unease, like China, to come in and strike security or policing deals with these countries. So, yes, this is an initiative that is designed to bolster the Pacific, but there's also an element of strategic self-interest. And I think that's what's being picked up here by some, by no means all, but by some leaders in the Pacific. Now, it's worth noting that even though, the Prime Minister of Vanuatu mentioned these concerns, it didn't stop him from allowing it to go through. It has been endorsed unanimously by the Pacific Islands Forum, but Australia will need to manage some of these dynamics carefully to make sure that some of these murmurs of unease about the initiative don't grow into anything more substantial.
Meanwhile, New Caledonia is still recovering from recent violence, which has been a concern for all of the region. How have leaders addressed this?
Look, it's difficult to say whether PIF is going to be able to make any progress on New Caledonia. This is a really difficult and fraught topic. You might remember last week a Pacific Islands Forum leaders delegation, the so-called Troika, were meant to visit New Caledonia on a mission ahead of this meeting in Tonga this week. But that mission fell apart, largely because they couldn't get agreement between the members of the New Caledonian government and the French government over who should have ultimate authority over the visit. Now, it sounds like they're very close to resolving that. At least they hope that people in Tonga hope that very soon they'll be in a position to actually announce what the terms of reference for that visit might be and how it's going to work. And there's a growing sense of confidence that at least there's a very decent chance that the visit will be able to go ahead in the coming weeks or months. But it's still not entirely clear exactly what role the Pacific can or should play on mediation here, particularly because France remains really deeply allergic to the idea that the Pacific is in any position to mediate between the French state and a government which in the end remains part of a French territory. So it's a difficult situation. Some Pacific leaders say that all they can really do usefully is call for calm, but there's also not much sympathy for France here in Tonga, and there's a feeling amongst Pacific leaders here that France not only needs to make concessions in order to allow this mission to come in as soon as possible, but at least according to some Pacific leaders, it needs to have a more serious conversation about exactly what decolonisation looks like in New Caledonia over the long term.
UN Chief Antonio Guterres is attending the meeting, and he's keen to focus on climate change in the Pacific.
Look, we'll have to wait and see. Certainly there's a desire amongst Pacific nations for much more money to be ploughed into the Pacific Resilience Facility. That's a new climate fund that's been set up by the Pacific for the Pacific to try and give them easier access to climate finance, something that they've often struggled to do through some of the traditional multilateral channels. Now, some countries have poured in money. Australia's tipped in 100 million, Saudi Arabia 50 million. We've had the United States announcing today that it would increase its contribution from 5 million to 25 million. But other countries are a bit more hesitant. We heard, for example, from the EU earlier today that they weren't yet sure about exactly how the PRF was operating and weren't necessarily, at least, convinced at this stage that it was the best way forward. So the Pacific Resilience Facility is going to be an important point of discussion. Pacific Island nations are going to continue to press wealthier and developed countries to pour more money into it and into other climate funds to ensure they've got the money they need to adapt to the cascading impacts of climate change. But there's still a big gap between what the Pacific wants from the rest of the world and what it's willing to give when it comes to climate change and finance.